So I thought this is a pretty good opportunity to go over the few different ways that you can lower a coil-sprung car. First one, and probably really the best one, is adjustable suspension. Now basically how the suspension works is you've got the weight of the car pushes down on the top hat there, the weight's transferred down through the spring onto the spring hanger, and then the spring hanger is connected to the shock body. Alright? So the spring more or less takes the weight of the car, and the shock does two things. The shock, first of all, has to hold the spring captive, which we'll get to, and it also stops the car from bouncing. If you didn't have a shock, the car would just bounce on down the road, and if you didn't have the spring, the shock would just bottom out and it would sit right down completely lowered. So basically on an adjustable suspension setup, you have the weight coming down and you can adjust this lower spring perch. So you can imagine if I took that down an inch, the spring would drop an inch, and as a result the car would drop an inch, depending on the angles, but more or less that's how it works. So there's a few benefits of adjustable suspension. The first one is in the name, adjustable. That it's very easy to get the car the height that you want. You know, if you want to drop it 10 mil, you can just jump in there, you can adjust it down to where you want to, and you can get the car at a perfect height. The second thing is that the springs generally come in a standardized diameter, which means if you want to change the spring rate, as in you want to make the car ride harder or softer, then you can purchase off the shelf this specific diameter spring, replace it, and you're good to go. The downsides of them are to buy them new, they're quite expensive, and to find them for oddball stuff, especially like the old Corolla and that, they can be quite hard to find, if not impossible. And the third thing is, in a lot of countries they need to be engineered or certified. If you change them over, then you need to pay the money, go through the inspection and get them properly certified. So the next option after your coilovers or adjustables is just an aftermarket spring and shock. More or less the biggest difference is that the spring perch is not adjustable, so you can't really change you can't change the height of the vehicle without changing the springs. And the other thing is often these will run the same diameter springs as original, so it's a lot harder to find the different spring rates for that shock setup. You can also just run these aftermarket springs on an original shock as long as they're captive. Which brings me to the next option, which is a modified original spring. This is an original shock and spring setup. You have obviously the spring perch, which we've talked about, which is not adjustable. You've got the spring, which is held on by the top hat. And if you try and move that won't move at all. So basically, the shock is at full open and it's holding the spring in place. And that won't move at all. That's an original setup. And this is the modified original setup. As you can see, it's a lot shorter. And you can modify them in two ways. They can either be cut or they can be heated and compressed. Now, cut springs get a bad rap, and probably for good reason, because of what I'm about to say. Right now, you can see that the car would be sitting a lot lower, alright? Using original shocks, if I'm to release that, and the shock does what it's supposed to, which pushes itself back up, all of a sudden, this spring is no longer captive, alright? Now, it's all very good when it's sitting on the ground and it looks cool and it's nice and low. However, you go over a decent bump, or you go around a corner and one side lifts up fairly substantially, and you've got this going on, this spring can become dislodged, and it's not ideal. So, the option to fix that is to get your shock shortened. Now, basically what that is getting an engineer to cut the top off, and then they machine up the top part of the shock shaft with the same narrowing and thread, or whatever your original shock looks like. And then that means that when you put this on here, your shortened spring, and you effectively put your top hat on, if that there was say 3-4 inches lower, that would now be holding that spring captive. Which, the reason that cut springs and compressed springs get a bad rap is because a lot of people cut them and don't worry about changing the shocks, and they then have non-captive springs, which is where it's dangerous. On a spring and shock combination like this, where the shock goes up through the center, it's not as bad. It's still not ideal, but it's not as bad because that spring can't go anywhere. But you can imagine in a situation like this vehicle, where the spring is separate to the shock, if that spring was all of a sudden cut shorter and not captive, you go over a bump, the suspension droops down like this, the spring falls out, and then you come back down, the weight comes down, and all of a sudden you've got no spring there, you can run into big problems. So this is where it's most important. It's always important, but this is where it's most important to have captive springs. And that brings us to another way of lowering a vehicle, which is airbags. And more or less these are a spring replacement. So you remove the coil spring and you bolt that in its place. And if it's got low pressure in it, the bag compresses, the car drops as though you've got a short spring in it. And if you increase the air pressure, the bag extends and lifts the car up as though you've got a long spring in it. Now, these are really cool, but they can be quite a lot of work to put in because you do need to make mounting plates top and bottom to bolt them in place of the spring. You also need to run air lines and compressor and an air tank and switches, and in a lot of countries you do need to get engineering certificate or certification when you install them in a vehicle. And although traditionally it's older vehicles that are airbagged, and they again traditionally have a spring and shock separate arrangement, you can now buy, as in probably for the last 10 years, you can now buy airbags with more or less a hole right up through the center, and that way you can put them in place of spring on a regular shock, on a McPherson strut or a shock similar to this, and it just goes in place of the spring. And obviously when it's aired out, there's no air in it, the pressure goes down, the car drops. When you put pressure to it and you fill it up, the car goes back up. And that's the very basics of lowering a car. I guess the takeaway message would be, if you're using aftermarket springs, if you're using cut springs, or if you're using heated and compressed springs, or even if you're using adjustable suspension, as long as your springs are captive, you'll be fine. It's when your springs are no longer captive, that's when you're going to run into problems.